With Oppenheimer absolutely cleaning up at the Oscars, I wanted to do a little video talking about 5 things that I've learned about Oppenheimer and how they made the film that I just find incredibly intriguing. And on top of that, I think these are 5 things that not enough people are talking about. So let's jump into it. The first is how truly photochemical this process was for this film. And here's what I mean by comparison. Most IMAX films, the way it works is you capture it on an IMAX film camera, and then those negatives are developed and scanned in, and then the rest of the process is treated digitally. You edit it digitally, you know, if any visual effects or CG happens, and then you can even do a digital color process too. And at the end, those digital files are printed back onto print film, and then you watch that. But that's not how they did Oppenheimer. If you saw one of the film projection options for Oppenheimer, what you saw for an overwhelming majority of the film was the negatives that came out of the IMAX camera. They probably were duplicated, right? So there were backups. But those photochemical negatives got transferred to the print positives that went to the theaters without a digital process in between, which is insane. This so rarely happens even on IMAX presentations. Now you might be thinking, wait, how did they edit the film? Didn't they use, digital software? Well, absolutely. Well, they scanned the negatives so they could edit them in digital software, but then they didn't export from the digital software and print it back. They actually went and did physical cuts of the negatives, in a more traditional photochemical process, and then use those to transfer to the print. So for an overwhelming majority of the film, you are seeing a truly photochemical process from start to finish. Now, if you watch the behind the scenes, you probably noticed that while an IMAX camera was used to film most of the project, they also used a 65mm camera as well. And what I find interesting is IMAX cameras and System 65, I believe, was their 65mm camera. They actually use the same film stock. The difference is how that film runs through the camera. So on IMAX cameras, the film runs horizontally. So you're capturing the images horizontally with the perforations on the top and bottom. And what this allows you to do is capture a much larger image, whereas on the 65mm camera, it's running vertically. Now, both are great, but oftentimes the IMAX cameras are so loud that for intimate dialogue scenes, you really need to use the quieter 65mm option. To be clear here, I'm not throwing shade on anyone who captures a movie on film, does a digital process, and prints it back to film. That's totally fine. I'm just pointing out how rare it is for someone to follow this photochemical process in this day and age. The second thing I find utterly fascinating about this film is the black and white sections. Now, if we were doing a digital DI process, you could capture this whole thing on color film, just turn down the saturation dial and print it back to film and call it a day. But once again, they are trying to honor the photochemical process in this project. So you know what they did? They went out and tried to see, do we have black and white 65mm stock? And you know what the answer was? No. Before this film, there wasn't a standard black and white 65mm stock available for them to capture on. So they had to go through a huge amount of research and development process with Kodak to actually get some 65mm stock for this film. It was an immense endeavor to do it, but eventually what Kodak came up with was a larger 65mm version of their Eastman XX stock that's black and white. This already exists for 35mm film, but we haven't seen an adaptation of it to the 65mm format. But here's the thing that I don't see people talking about, and I just can't seem to find a good answer on. When you capture a film negative in black and white, well, that negative isn't what people see in the theater. That gets developed and then printed to a positive. And the positive that seems to have been used for this film was Kodak's 2383 print film, very much an industry standard. And this seems to be confirmed by some pictures I've seen. What's really interesting, though, is Kodak's 2383 print film stock often has an effect on the neutral portions of the image. Let me show you what I mean here in DaVinci Resolve. So here, built into DaVinci Resolve, we actually have a really great 2383 print film emulation LUT that the guys at DaVinci Resolve, I trust that they've done some really good research to make this very accurate. Now, in order to make sure that this looks correct with our footage, I have to drop a color space transform in and just make sure we're transforming this footage correctly. So this is Blackmagic Design Wide, and then this is Film Gen 5. There we go, and it's out to Rec 709 color space, and then I'm going to use the Cinean film log here. All right, so what we have here is the Kodak 2383 print film emulation. So I can label this just to make it obvious, 2383. And if I were to pull all saturation out of this image, similarly, if we were to feed black and white into it, you'll notice this isn't black and white. Do you see the blue hues in the shadow? This is sometimes maybe it's easier to see on a gray ramp. If I were to take all effects off, this is neutral gray. Here's a black and white image being fed into 2383. Do you see this cool shading going on? So what I would have anticipated in the theater is if the image would have had this blue cast to the shadow, given that it was a black and white image printed to Kodak's 2383. But when I watched this in the theater near me, there wasn't this blue bias. So I wonder, did they do something to the color timing of the image to bias out those cool tones? So if you saw an IMAX film projection version of this, did you notice this blue hue coming into the shadows? If you didn't see this effect, I seriously wonder if they slightly biased the black and white elements warm. So I'm gonna just grab this offset here and warm up the image slightly, so that we're biasing out a lot of the blues. So now, if I were to go to this grayscale ramp and pull off the adjustments, you'll notice we're not getting nearly as much of a blue influence, but the highlights are getting a bit warmer. This effect feels like black and white, but with warmer highlights. The third thing that I found interesting is hearing how Christopher Nolan and the team talked about practical effects in this film. Because Christopher Nolan is not an anti-visual effects guy, right? Like, he's done the Dark Knight trilogy. Like, there were a bunch of visual effects in that. What you'll notice in a lot of his interviews and the interviews of his team is they separate out two terms: CG and VFX. So you'll notice that what they constantly say is there was no computer-generated images, no CG. And sometimes what I think people anticipate is when they hear no CG, they think there has been no digital effects at all on this film. And that's not true. The difference is computer-generated rather than sourced from real life. I've found some conflicting numbers on this, but there seems to be some consensus on around 100 shots in the film were scanned from the IMAX, had some digital things done to it, and then they were printed back to the print film. But these things could have been as small as maybe there was something out of time period that, visual effects just needed to, paint out on a certain shot. But what I think is far more interesting than just, how many shots had a digital touch to them is why. Why did they choose to do so much practically? And what I found is through a lot of the interviews that have been done, there was this theme, and that is when you know something is real, it has a more visceral and terrifying effect because you know that it actually happened. Christopher Nolan has actually done a nuclear explosion before, so if you've seen the Dark Knight trilogy, right, at the end of, what is it? Is it Dark Knight Rises, where they have that nuclear explosion off in the distance? And he often compares those two nuclear explosions. You'll hear him say things like, in the Dark Knight, they didn't feel the need to do a practical, nuclear explosion, because what are we trying to communicate through that one in the Dark Knight? Well, that explosion is supposed to feel like we've had some sort of victory. It's far off. It's not close to us or scaring us. The danger is farther away. So he feels like that's a great time to use completely computer-generated images. But on a film like Oppenheimer, where we're supposed to feel the threat, feel the heat in the theater, feel that danger, he just says knowing that something is physically done has such a greater effect on us. Also, whenever we can do things in camera, right, like when Oppenheimer was sitting in his bed and those little beads were spinning, they actually put those beads in the shot. And why? Why did they do this? So they could keep as much of a photochemical process as possible. I've heard people throw around numbers like IMAX is the equivalent to an 18K camera. And I can't verify that. But if you were to scan it digitally, you're not going to try to scan an 18K image. You're probably going to scan it down to something more like 8K or 6K. So when you print it back to film, there will be some detail loss, even if it's incredibly minor. Number 4, I quite literally laughed out loud when I found out about this. Those vibrating backgrounds that happen in the film, well, once again, those were practical effects. They actually just took a high-resolution picture of the background they were filming on, fed it through a projector on set, and then had the projector jiggle the images. And what a brilliant idea. Also, how much money did that potentially save? I feel like the idea of projecting that image, it sounds almost so low tech, but think of the things they could do on set. They could adjust how much it's shaking. They could adjust, the frequency, the volume of the shake, and they would see it all right there and then, knowing how it would look to the end audience. The fifth thing I loved learning about the film is some of the unique lenses they had to develop for it. So IMAX cameras and the corresponding lenses, they tend not to have a very close focus ability. They're built for these, large vista shots. So think like, National Geographic, or these large spectacles and landscapes. But in Oppenheimer, you'll notice the camera is often positioned so close to the actors' faces. And in order to do this, they actually had to have some new lenses engineered for the IMAX camera. And some of these lenses had really large apertures. Like there's mention that some of them were like, T1.9 or T2 along the way. And many times these lenses were used wide open. There's an interview with one of the focus pullers on the film, and he was basically describing how on some of the shots, they've basically got like a couple centimeters to work with. And although he was pretty calm about it in the interview, I feel like I could see a little, fear behind his eyes there, because what a challenge to pull off something like that. I know I was only going to tell you 5 points, but here's the last bonus one. 5 days before the production was supposed to film in their Oval Office set, their location dropped. Now, I just have to say, that's encouraging for any of us, who don't have the budget of Christopher Nolan, to know that even his sets, even he has location problems at times. So in 5 days, they actually built a new Oval Office set in a soundstage using some parts and pieces that were in storage in another facility that they were able to rent, and then they built and painted a whole bunch as well. So there you go. There are 5 things, plus a bonus, that I loved learning about Oppenheimer, and hopefully you learned as well. Were any of these particularly interesting to you? Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you saw one of the IMAX film presentations, get back to me on the black and white sections. Did you feel like you noticed a cool bias in the shadows? Or do you think maybe that they color timed it a bit warmer so that the shadows were more neutral, but maybe the highlights warmed up along the way? I'm incredibly interested to find out from your experience. All right, if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to see more content like this, and hopefully you'll leave your thoughts down in the comments. All right, I'll see you in the next one.